So I'm going to do a very short introduction just to tell you a little bit about why the Labyrinth project started, and I'm going to hand over to our evaluation partners to tell you a bit more about what it did and what we achieved. So, as you said, one of the aims of the project is to strengthen the women's sector. And today we're going to hope to discuss a little bit about that in the context of the cost of living crisis and kind of the, I won't say aftermath, but the continuation of the pandemic and the impact that we know it's had on women. So many of you will know women's lives are complex and they often include a range of issues, whether that's violence they've experienced, financial challenges, employment issues, and legal issues. So we wanted to bring together a project that could look at the way in which women interact with services and look to, I suppose, fill in some of those gaps that we know are there, or help women to navigate the complex set of services that are out there for them. It can be really hard for women to access support across multiple agencies, or even to know where to start to get support. But we know that women helping women in spaces that are created for them and by them leads to incredible support and can make a huge step towards any recovery and the independence that we're seeking for all women. Despite many organisations doing great work around the country, it can still be difficult to get a joined up approach in local areas and to link up organisations across the UK. And the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated a lot of the issues that women face, whether that's legal issues, finance and debt, legal issues, not legal issues, and access to employment. With our partners across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, the Labyrinth project aims to support women's spaces like we're in today, and services to help them help women and emerge stronger from the pandemic and ensure that women's lives can continue and prosper. Before handing over to our evaluation partner, I just want to say a few things. So firstly, thank you to Tampon Tax and the Department for funding the project and really allowing us to have a more open scope for the project and allow us to really look into the issues that that women are facing and women's services are facing and look to identify and rectify some of those. So our incredible grantees, all 40 of them that we were able to fund through the Empowering Women grants and the amazing work they've been doing across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. To our delivery partners who were part of the partnership, hearing from a couple of them later today, are in 8 different locations and 5 specialist training partners, some of whom are joining us as well. And finally to the Solace team who helped to make this happen, and particularly to Alia, who is doing another role today in being our tech guru for this event, but she's worn many different hats to allow this project to work over the last 18 months, and we couldn't have done it without her. So as my final thank you is to our evaluation partners, the UMFS, and I will hand over them to tell you a bit more about the project.
Hello. So I'm Sarah Scott, for those who've never met me on Zoom. So I'm the SS bitch of DMFS. And I was wondering what I could call my little 5-minute. And in the end, I decided I had to call it Labyrinth Has Astonished Me. And that's because we as DMSS were approached at the bid stage of Labyrinth. And we looked at the idea that was going to go to the Tampon Tax, and we said we're really happy to be included in the bid of the. And then I turned around to Di and I said, we were off. And I think possibly some of the other partners who signed up at that very early stage thought the same, and also got a phone call saying it's going to happen, and went, okay, what do we do now? So we were fairly gobsmacked when it was funded, and at that point, of course, reread the bid, the proposal. 3 countries, 13 partners, 1 post-pandemic year, a small grant scheme, a huge training programme, and 8 area-based capacity development projects. it certainly did sound well named as being a labyrinth. Di and I have had about 30 years experience as evaluators, and had been involved in feminist projects of various sorts since the 1980s. And we thought we were pretty good judges of whether an initiative was likely to be a success. And to be honest, looking at this one cold, it looked like a long shot. And well, we were spectacularly wrong. And as the evaluation and learning partners, what we've been able to do is to keep that sort of oversight in the same way that the central team has of the way in which the different strands have developed over time. And that's why I called it Labyrinth as Astonishment, because it genuinely has. I can't speak in 5 minutes about everything that's worked. It's in the report in quite a lot of detail. And I'm not going to bore you with graphs. I haven't got any of those with me, or with numbers in relation to it. And in fact, I thought I'd like to begin by highlighting instead the learning from probably the element of the project that people have thought was least successful. And that is the aspect of offering training on national training partners, not just to staff and volunteers, but directly to women who were using the services. And over the course of the project, there's been a lot of concern with navigators and from the central team at times of saying, we're not getting the sign up directly from women, or when we are getting sign up, they're not turning up, they're dropping out. And we've had to cancel quite a lot of sessions, and some of those sessions ended up being delivered to just one woman. You can learn more from things that don't necessarily work as you expect than you can learn from the things which are a raving success and go just as planned. And I think there's an awful lot to be learned from this particular experience. But the first thing that I'd say is that it by no means looked like a failure when you got to the end and we were in a position to write the reports. So in terms of the national training offer for the one strand of Labyrinth, there were over 1,000 women who attended training for the course of the year. And 144 of those were women service users. And there is one woman who I'd like to quote, who isn't here today, I don't imagine, but she was one of those who ended up being trained, having a training session one-to-one, because she was the only woman who turned up for a particular session. And she said, I went into this session on Zoom emotionally and intellectually wounded from a negative experience, and I received desperately needed reassurance. The trainer actually turbo boosted my confidence. The generic training itself was extremely useful and relevant to me, but that moment of personal reassurance was undiluted salvation and relief, and it was invaluable to me. That one-to-one webinar turned out to be something of a lottery win to me. And I just thought that was tremendously powerful and a reminder that Labyrinth is something that's worked on so many different levels, including actually the 144 women who gave feedback in relation to what they got from that. And the training was right for them. So although indeed we identified issues about how you get women in, whether it's okay to do it on Zoom, should we be doing something different? And the project then developed through the navigator some other kinds of local offers, which might have fitted more easily with some service users. The fact is that the thing that was identified as perhaps the weakest bit of Labyrinth, in fact, had an enormous amount of success attached. So I wanted to tell you briefly about a few of the things that have made Labyrinth the kind of success that it has been.
Sarah, sorry to interrupt. Would you mind speaking a little bit louder? There's a little bit of sound issue in the Zoom. Yes,
Will
please.
do.
Thank you.
Okay. The ingredients of the success of this labyrinthine project that we've identified in the course of doing the learning process and the evaluation are the skill, experience, and the caliber of the partner organisations involved. So however shocked some of you were to find yourselves part of this project, wow, did everybody throw themselves in. So that commitment has been crucial. But also the individuals who have made it up have brought an incredible range of particular skill, experience to that role. So there's been a absolute ground foundation of ability there, but you could still have ended up with something that was a lot of disparate parts. And the thing that ensured that it wasn't was really fantastic project management. It has been spectacularly well managed. And so it is not just its bits, it's the sum of those bits that we've been able to capture. A further ingredient of success has been the flexibility that was allowed. So everybody working in those different 8 areas and the projects they were attached to were quite different in form. They were encouraged and went out and looked locally at what the gaps and issues were, and then they were allowed to develop their own ways of addressing them. That flexibility is so rare. When you put in a funding bid, you're generally being asked to define exactly what you're going to do, and then you get assessed against it. And that was a really, really exceptionally lovely thing about the Tampon Tax funding, and then about the way that that was actually constructed in Labyrinth. The other thing that I would really pull out as an ingredient of success for Labyrinth is actually COVID. Because the sector's adaptations that had already been made prior to this project starting, and the ways in which projects were working, partly going online, which, let's face it, was happening to absolutely everybody, but also some very things that were very particular to the women's sector, and certainly looking across the women's sector were more significant to the women's sector. And one of those was about the fact that not everybody working in these organisations was particularly techie. Strangely, it opened doors for more involvement of some women who previously would not have been taking a leadership role and became involved in a different kind of level. Some of those were simply opportunities for younger women who were more techie than some of us old ducks, I speak for myself. But it was also the case that women who were users of services in many different organisations actually became active as providers of peer support, running groups, those kinds of things. Those things had sort of already happened. So by the time that Labyrinth came along, one, we were all prepared to do an awful lot of it online, just delighted that occasionally we could do a few things face to face. And secondly, that possibility of more involvement by women service users was already happening. There was just this real push towards more co-production that was already going on around the place. And that felt a bit like a bit of a return Back to the Future moment in terms of who was running and generating what. But it was one of the things that I would say. So COVID, lots of disadvantages for women's lives in general, but funnily enough, a real opportunity opener for this particular project. One of the things that we did drew out in the course of writing the evaluation report were the kind of underlying building blocks for Labyrinth that we thought were very powerful in terms of what could be taken forward in the future. And one of the things that was special about Labyrinth was, in a way, the kind of original impetus that Rebecca's described that came from two places. part of that impetus was this recognition of the complexity of issues in women's lives and the complexity of services they were often having to deal with, and simply wanting something that was more joined up and coherent that would give women a better service. But at the same time, the other impetus was the kind of fourth wave of feminism that was going on at the same time. So the fact was that there was something else happening in the world that made it just feel that bit more possible that a joined up sector could be re-energized if we could just find the right techniques for so doing. And the techniques were the ones that have been described. And it did seem like an incredible challenge at the time. But the fact was that national training, local navigators, the small grants fund together seemed to be really exciting opportunities for building sector development. And I believe that Labyrinth has really played a part in revitalising that sense of the sector, the women's sector as a sector. The building blocks that we identified, which we think are there for future initiatives to draw on in terms of strengthening the sector and better meeting women's needs, are, well, they are connection, capacity and confidence, co-creation, diversity and development. And I'm only going to say a few words about each of those. It's in the report. You can read how we've unpacked them there. But just to say that connection was incredibly important. Through the mapping of provision and need in the local areas that were involved, navigators built a picture of their local women's sector, its strengths, its weaknesses, and they were therefore able to identify the opportunities for connectivity and for making that connection. I could give many examples from across the project. One in particular that stood out for me was the way in which the navigators who job shared in Manchester entered the homelessness arena in that city, recognising that there were plenty of women working in the homeless sector who were concerned about homelessness for women, but they weren't connected up with the women's sector, and that by making those connections, they could really improve the direct provision. And they did it in such a way that homeless women themselves were involved in that process and in that movement to improve what the provision was. And at the same time as that was going on, the National Navigator Forum that met regularly and the Action Learning meetings that met enabled a kind of sharing of ideas and initiatives across the countries involved. And we observed quite a lot of actually borrowing and rerunning, and women saying not just that they'd increased their kind of sense of being kind of connected up and part of a national or multinational movement, but also just that ability to look at what was going on in other places and go, oh, we could do that, or we could try that one. So that kind of cross-fertilization was an incredibly important part of connection. Some of the capacity and confidence, the second building block, simply came from that connecting with a wider movement. But it did also come from having access to the expert knowledge and experience of national organisations, some of which, like Rights of Women, had found themselves kind of talking to London almost entirely because that's where the funding came from. And again, people were able to tap in, know how good that quality was, and to feel bigger and stronger because of being able to tap into it. Recipients of small grants through this programme, in the feedback that came from them, what they really emphasised was, again, this huge boost in confidence that they gained, partly just from their application being successful, and then the additional value of the capacity building that was built into that. many of those organisations, these small grassroots organisations, are kind of co-created or, you know, co-constructed from the start, i.e. it's women doing it for themselves. That's what they are. And they're growing groups and projects out of that process. And Labyrinth recognised the importance of projects that enable women to care about and for each other through peer support and through the sense of being involved in a movement to improve women's lives. And they drew in women with a whole range of kinds of experience. They drew in women who would not otherwise have had contact with the women's sector and its services. So not just women who'd experienced domestic abuse, but homelessness, no recourse to public funds, women who were seeking asylum, women who'd lost children to care, and women with mental health issues and other complex needs. And they created with those women some spaces where they could participate on equal terms with service providers, commissioners, all sorts of things like that that happened in there. And they created some very bespoke workshops for very small groups of women. And the one that comes to mind for me there would be Hampshire. Series of workshops designed for very particular small groups of local women across an incredibly large and rural patch. The fourth building block is diversity. And the mapping was very important there, because the mapping, which actively sought to look for gaps in provision, unmet need, unheard voices, ensured that there was a kind of appreciation of women's different and sometimes divergent needs. And it was then reflected in the pieces of work that navigators chose to focus on and prioritise locally. And in almost all cases, that local work focused on the ways in which different forms of oppression intersect in women's lives, and the experiences of inequality, and particularly in terms of reaching out to Black and minoritized women and the groups that they were themselves running. And one of the examples that I said, I can't possibly cover all of those wonderful things, but I pulled out one example of a group that we featured as a case study in the report, and it's a women's farming group for refugees and asylum seekers based in Glasgow. Seems an unlikely context for a farming group, doesn't it? But that was 20 odd women participated in that group, and they came from Libya and Nigeria and South Africa and Malawi and Iran and Glasgow. And they all had an interest in food, as we all tend to have, and farming. And this was their starting point for working together about their own experience of both asylum seeking and being women in Glasgow. You can see some of the other case studies in the course of the report. I think that possibly one of the things that some parts of the project know least about is the small grants programme. So it's been very nice to be able to reflect that alongside the other strands that you'll be more familiar with. And the final building block that we thought was very significant, we've called development. Feminism needs to constantly renew itself by developing the next generation of activists and practitioners, and growing and nurturing new organisations and ways of working. So Labyrinth's seed funding for these very small self-running groups was incredibly important. And at the same time, it connected those groups up to the possibility of having contact with big national, well-established organisations, to being involved in training, and it provided informal workshops that were really for beginners in any kind of social action terms, as well as for well-established projects. And over half of those small grants went to groups that were Black and minoritized women's groups. Opening up training directly to women supported organisations to provide pathways for some of those women to move from being recipients to providers of support to others, to speak out from their own lived experience, or to become practitioners and activists in the women's sector. That's a fantastic achievement in 1 year, in 8 places around the country, and in the 40-odd groups that were funded. So in conclusion, I would just say that if what Labyrinth did was test an idea about how you can improve services for women and at the same time strengthen this women's sector in the UK, it has shown that there really are some very, very effective ways of doing so. And it's shown that as extensively as it possibly could in an 18-month period. It's evidenced the value of those 5 building blocks in helping to achieve the outcomes that it set out to achieve. And I therefore believe that they offered some very solid foundations for further work in this area, which is about the strength and future of the women's sector in the UK. And it's been a delight to be the learning part for Labyrinth. Thank you.
So that was just to say a little bit about those numbers that we were talking about in terms of what the project's achieved. But again, all in the evaluation report, which we'll be sharing with guests after this. So we talked about the Empowering Women Fund and that being one of the key components of the Labyrinth project, and that allowing us to fund 40 women-focused organisations across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And we're really delighted today that Tanya from Sister System.
Okay.
Tanya's standing. Is here with us today to tell us a little bit about the project they ran through the Empowering Women Fund. Yes. So
hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm not actually Tanya, I know Keller, but Tanya is my right hand in many ways, but she is our programs manager and very much caught up in some safeguarding related issues, and so sadly couldn't be with us today. So it's just me here to talk to you about our leadership program and a little bit about Sister System, who we are, what we do, and what the Labyrinth project has enabled us to do with the girls and young women that we work with. So I'm O Keller, and I'm the director and founder of Sister System. Oh. Okay, so Sister System was founded back in 2018, so we are a very new organisation, but we were founded by myself and a group of professionals and care leavers with lived experience of the care system, and as such we were able to collectively have a very unique lens from both the professionals and a young person's view of what the gaps are in the statutory service provisions for girls and young women who are living in the care system or affected by the care system. Should we? Is it moving?
They're kind of moving on automatically.
We want slide 2. Who are we? Yeah. So Sister System was founded in order to offer a new model of working, a new way of working with girls and young women who had been through the care system, a model that put them at the centre and acknowledged them as the experts and who would work alongside us to co-create programmes that would be delivered by them and for them to enable and enhance and empower them to overcome the traumas as to why they've ended up in the care system and the traumas that they then have to deal with when they are part of the care system. Our overall aim is to decrease the number of girls and young women who end up as the survivors of abuse, to decrease the number of girls and young women in the care system who end up with a diagnosable mental health illness, and to decrease the number that end up as long-term not in education, employment and training. And in this way, we seek to break the intergenerational cycle of abuse, joblessness and poverty that we see for so many girls and young women in London and across the UK. So Sister System does this by providing 8 different educational empowerment programs. As I said, all of them have been co-created with myself, my team, and the experts who are the girls and young women themselves. All of our programs are accredited by the Open College Network Centre. We are an approved centre, and they all work to cover those intersectional inequities that these girls and young women have to go on across their journey through adolescence into womanhood, which I'm sure we'll all agree has a plethora of challenges within it, without having to deal with the additional challenges that these girls and young women are presented with every day. Should we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So who are our sisters? Who are these amazing young women that I have the pleasure of working with on a day-to-day basis? Oh, it's moving itself again. So around about 95% of our girls and young women are Black and brown girls and young women. We work with an age range of 13 to 24, so we cover that adolescence journey and out into early womanhood. And depressingly, around 97% of them are survivors. We do not refer to our sisters as victims, we refer to them as survivors. Language that you use in conversations and when you're talking about them is incredibly important, so we're always very aware of the choice of words that we choose to use when we're describing the women that we work alongside. We're based in Haringey in North London, which is one of the most deprived areas of the UK. It's certainly a red flag area for the Met, with one of the highest crimes of youth violence, of gangs and cohesion, of joblessness, and with a very low academic attainment level. So we deliberately targeted Haringey as the first borough that we wanted to provide our services in. And since we moved there in late 2018, we've supported around about 426 girls to forge pathways into independence, to raise their mental well-being by equipping them with tools and strategies so that they can independently navigate themselves into a more fulfilling life. So let's talk a bit specifically about the leadership program. Did we miss their challenges? I think I kind of covered them, right? But I took the challenges. Of course, all compounded by COVID-19 and by the cost of living crisis. And so the time that we made our application to the Labyrinth for the leadership program, we were right in the grip and the midst of these unprecedented set of events that were having an absolutely catastrophic impact on my team, on the organisation that we had worked so hard to set up, but most importantly, on the girls and young women that we were working alongside on a day-to-day basis. And so one of the programs, it's got a mind of its own. It's an empowered PowerPoint again. One of our programs is called the Leadership Program, and this is the program that we specifically again targeted the Labyrinth Fund to apply to. We felt that we had great mission alignment, that we shared a sense of what we were trying to change in our small ecosystem in Haringey. The Leadership Unlocked program, which was written, as I said, by myself and some of the girls, older girls and young women that have transitioned out of the care system, is really about helping these girls and young women to develop leadership skills for themselves so that they can lead themselves and be excellent role models to their peers in their community, in that way cascading the skills and knowledge of behaviours that they learn and that we equip them with over a 12-month period. Our programme is made up of various different components or elements, as we would refer to them as, and they include our 6 resilience building modules, which are all bespoke to Sister System and cover themes such as who are you, who am I, and why do I care, relationships, communications, sex, drugs, and social media. The titles kind of give you an idea of the kind of things that we explore within those workshops, but they're really about raising the mental and emotional well-being of our girls and young women and helping them to find a voice and to share experiences that quite often we keep to ourselves because of the trauma and shame that's involved in them. And it's actually about creating a safe space for them to be able to identify similarities in their differences and also identify a sense of camaraderie that actually most of us have very sadly had to deal with and navigate ourselves through these iniquities, whether that is me sitting there as the director and founder and allegedly a professional woman, or whether it's her sitting opposite me as an 18-year-old girl leaving care, with a diagnosed mental health illness. Actually, we both in many ways walked the same path. So that's what the resilience building workshops are. We then deliver the level 2 qualification in leadership, which has been rewritten to talk to the story of their lives and to give them a sense of empowerment and to give them skill acquisition and knowledge acquisition, not only to get a level 2 qualification so they can forge a pathway into education, but to enable them to enjoy education and for it to be relevant to them and their lives and what they are having to grapple with, and kind of turning that on its head at the same time. We also ran a series of networking sessions, which is advice, information and guidance. And this came from across our multidisciplinary team, both internal and external, with a real focus on bringing into these girls and young women's lives local leaders, often Black and from other minority groups, to come and share their story and come and give them information and advice and some guidance on anything from how to navigate the housing system to how to lead for yourself effectively. And alongside that, they also receive one-to-one therapeutic mentoring to help them avoid and recover from their trauma, as well as peer-to-peer mentoring to help them to identify a positive peer relationship and to enable them to start cascading that and modelling that amongst their own peers. And in this way, what Sister System has done, not just with this group of incredible young women, but across our community, is build an incredibly powerful peer group of young women who firstly learn to believe in themselves and then in each other. And that ended in our graduation ceremony, which Aaliyah joined us with, which was a huge privilege, where amongst around 60 to 70 girls who graduated from across programs at Sister System, we had the girls that graduated from the Leadership Unlocked program. And there you can see some of us quite rightly incredibly proud. So the approach that we took to delivering this program really echoes the values and the principles of the Labyrinth project. It's all about creating a safe space for young women to come to, where their voice is heard, where they are valued. It provides a community of maternal and family-based support. So for these girls and young women, many of you were not brought up in a happy, safe family environment, who lost that intergenerational storytelling of who we are and why we're here and the roles that we play as girls and women in our family life. And so Sister System tries to model that for our girls and young women. That's one of the things that we do within the leadership program, and really highlighting all of those incredible women, both that we know and that we are many that we don't know of, who are leaders in their families, in their communities, and in society. We provide increased support when we talk about key transitional points. We're talking about points of transition in their education, in their journey through the care system, as well as our adolescent journey into womanhood. The positive peer support cycle, which I talked to a little bit earlier, has been one that has just flourished and thrived in the last 4 years of Sister System, and it just demonstrates to us how incredible our young people are. And if you give them the space and you give them a platform and you give them some of those tools, actually they themselves will be able to meet their own needs and the needs of their peers. All of the approaches that we use in all of our deliveries, in all of our programs at Sister System, are all trauma informed. So we weave in therapeutic disciplines and practices, and we weave in other practices such as restorative justice to ensure that the girls that we're working with are always very well supported, and that the trauma that they have had to suffer is at the centre of what we're doing to enable them to walk through that and come out the other side as empowered young women. And what we have found is that by doing these things, it furthers our opportunities for pathways, for employment and further education, not just for them, but it also enables Sister System as an organisation to really forge strong partnerships across our ecosystem in Haringey and North London. Yeah.
Control it for a bit.
Control it.
I'll be back.
So what was the impact of the leadership programme? So across those 12 months, coming out the other side and reflecting on what was achieved by the girls and young women that we worked with, we registered 32 girls onto this programme, which so it was oversubscribed, but we seem to find at Sister System that all of our programmes are always oversubscribed. So 32 girls and young women registered themselves on this programme. 12 of those were able to complete their level 2 leadership qualification. Many of them are still working towards completing that qualification. But for some of them, the other elements of the programme, those information, advice and guidance sessions, the one-to-one therapeutic mentoring, the peer support, they felt was more relevant. And by putting them at the centre, we allow them to work with us to decide which parts of a programme they want to engage with. And in that way, what we've discovered is that by giving them that voice, ultimately they do end up doing all of the programme, but they begin with the bits that they feel are most important to them. So in that way, the additional 20 girls benefited from those more pastorally focused elements of our programme, as opposed to the educational outcomes of the programme. What we know through our own monitoring and evaluation and data collection that we do throughout the journey of each programme, that is both done by the SISTAR herself and by the mentoring team and then by the leadership team. So we're all always evaluating each other all the time, I guess, is that all 32 of these young women reported a raise in their mental well-being because of taking part of this programme. And all of them reported that they felt better able and understood a lot better what a healthy relationship looks like versus a toxic relationship. And in this way, we were confident that we had provided these girls and young women with the knowledge that they needed to avoid or recover from unhealthy, toxic and abusive relationships, whether that's with their peers or in an intimate relationship, family, you know, the whole gambit, so to speak. So what did they have to say? Some of the feedback that we had on this programme, as you can see here, some of the quotes, so these are quotes that have come directly from the girls and young women that have taken part in the programme. I'll just give you a minute to read over those. And I think overall, the feedback at graduation was certainly one of a group of young women who felt incredibly empowered, who felt that they had found their voice and feel now confident enough to forge them a pathway into further education, to begin to look for employment, and to begin to want to be part of the change that we all in this sector are working so hard to see. And I think for me as the founder and the director, that is incredible that we now have girls and young women themselves saying, yes, you know, not only do I want to see these changes for myself and my peers, but I feel better able and better equipped to make these changes happen. I now know what they need to look like for myself. In terms of the impact that this funding has had, nearly last one. So in terms of the impact that this has had for Sister Systems as an organisation, being funded by the Labyrinth Project through the Tampon Tax Fund, it's been incredible. It's increased our sense of ability as a very young, small, buy and for organisation working in a really challenging and very competitive environment when it comes to securing funding. We all were absolutely empowered to be in receipt of this funding and felt that we had been heard, and as such our community would be heard. Ultimately, what this also did is Sister System, as I said at the beginning, is an Open College Network approved centre. The quality of portfolios that these girls and young women produce and the dedication of our assessors and facilitators and quality assurers actually means that we've now achieved direct claim status, which is a huge accomplishment for us as an organisation, having only been delivering programmes for 3 years, a couple of those being in the midst of a pandemic. So we just want to thank the Labyrinth Fund, thank Solace, and thank all the members of the team and everybody else that's been involved in this project. And we're really excited for what's going to happen next and where we'll be able to take everything that we've done together across the last 18 months next. So thank you. And I've been told by Tanya that I have to ask if there's any questions.
Hi, sorry, just when you thought you were going to get away with
I
it.
know, it's fine.
What a fantastic organisation and amazing sounding project.
Thank
You mentioned you were oversubscribed, that you had 32 looking on the program. Where did your referrals come from?
So we have 3 different referral routes. So we have a professional referral route, and they all come from social care and other education, the police, the CSE panels, which is child sexual exploitation panels, merit panels, and then we have self-referrals, which for me are the best type of referrals. And then we also have peer and family-based referrals. So we have foster carers will often refer their young people through to us, or friends or other community groups, or other people in the community will also refer girls through.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name's Soda Ashraf, and I also run a charity similar to yours.
Hi.
Wise. Hi there. We sort of started off our charity working with South Asian and Muslim women, and it was really came from a place of entrepreneurship, employment. And when we sort of worked with them for about 3-4 years, but when the pandemic happened, we sort of found a lot of our women were suffering from domestic abuse, and things like mental health issues started to come up. And that really made us go back to the drawing board and really think about the women that we were working with, because we were predominantly working with South Asian women who were economically inactive and were working in the cottage industries.
Okay.
So obviously they had those issues and they needed the empowerment. But one of the challenges that we're facing as an organization going through that curve, learning curve, is obviously I come from an entrepreneurial background and I know a lot of things about that, but when it comes to mental health and domestic abuse, and now we're feeling that we need to offer these services to our women, we're starting to develop that part of the business. And it's sort of like, you know, where you said you've got this leadership program, I was really intrigued by that, because we're trying to put programs together, and for us, because we're not experts, we don't have those skills, it's really difficult to really look at the content, whether if our content is really serving our audience. And of course, if you go for accreditation or you bring experts in, it's all about money and all of that. So we seem to be just going round and round. And I was wondering, do you actually help other organizations in that area? Because I know it's a tricky one.
So we are we've been commissioned under, so short answer is yes. But it's a very new strand of our work, and it's come from lots of other organisations like yourself saying, well, you know, could you train, do you train the trainer?
Yes, exactly.
Do you deliver any professional kind of delivery in terms of how are you delivering your programme? So we applied to the GLA's New Deal for Young People, and we were selected as a leader to deliver both Sister Systems' unique mentoring model, which covers the themes that you're talking about, alongside the mentoring quality framework, which has been developed by the GLA alongside a select number of organisations, and Sister Systems, one of those organisations. So you would be really welcome to join us. Brilliant. We are in session 3 of a 2-year programme. So we're only in the month 3 of a 2-year programme, I should say. So yeah, I can give you the details. You can sign up.
Are you still recruiting for the program?
Yeah. So we're working. I think we've got about 19 organisations signed up. We would love to work at the moment, but we have capacity for, again, Tanya, I can hear her sending me vibes, but yeah, we have space for probably about 30 organisations to take part. And the way that we've tried to do it to make it incredibly meaningful is that the first kind of 9 months is quite a generic delivery. This is how we've done it, and this is how the mentoring quality framework makes suggestions. In the second year, organisations that are able to make a solid commitment, we would match with one of our big sisters, and you would have a further year where you would work with us and a big sister to develop your own bespoke mentoring toolkit and embed it into your organisation. So we'd be hanging around until kind of 2024. So you know, if that's something that you think could maybe help to bridge some of the gaps, then please do register for the programme.
Brilliant, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We've made a link already, so we're
Yeah,
doing
that was
amazing. Links in the room, which is exactly what we wanted to do throughout. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was amazing. There might be more questions, I don't know, from the Q&A part later, so we couldn't do that. But I now wanted to bring up a few of our other delivery partners in Labyrinth who come and join us. So can I ask them to come to the stage and I'll introduce them while I go back to it. I would say seamless, but you've all just seen the presentation, and that was not. The presentation was seamless, the tech less so. Brilliant. So I'll try and speak as loud as I can for the camera, but let us know if you've got any issues.
A little bit. Get cozy.
There we go. Great. Yeah, huge thank you to those that have presented so far, and I suppose just to really to be able to give a flavour of what Labyrinth and the Empowering Women's Grants Fund's been able to do. So huge thank you to the system. Yeah, amazing to hear about that. So I'll introduce the rest of the panel as we just have a little bit more of a discussion about kind of what Labyrinth brought to their local areas, their organisations, and I suppose a little bit of reflection on what next for the women's sector. So firstly, I wanted to introduce Benaika, who is the CEO of Hopscotch Women's Centre. I need to say thank you for letting me use the space today as well for this event. It's hugely appreciated. We have Emily as well on my left, an economic abuse specialist from Surviving Economic Abuse. And I have Jeanette, who is Projects and Partnerships Director from Leeds Women's Aid. All 3 organisations were delivery partners under Labyrinth. So I'm just here to pose a couple of questions. Benaika, if I can ask you first, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how the Labyrinth project supported the women's sector in your local area and what kind of benefits you've seen from it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for us, it this project really coincided with next steps for us as an organisation. So it's fantastic. Doing that mapping exercise, I want to introduce you all to Fairy, who's sitting at the back of the Grace car. So she is our project lead and is our organisation's org expert. So the mapping exercise she did really fitted in with the mapping exercises that we needed to be doing as an organisation as well, because as you said, you know, we specialise in violence against women and girls and unemployment and poverty, but how to bring all of that together, especially at the beginning of lockdown when we knew we just couldn't be having all these disparate programs anymore. We needed to wrap around women. But where were these women? What were their barriers? What did they have available to them where they lived? And this, I cannot tell you how valuable that piece of work was for us to be paid to do mapping, exactly as he said, as you know, a real gift. So we took great advantage of that, and from that we started to move to a one-stop shop format where we could work with grassroots organizations. So we're just starting out. So we're empowering them whilst bringing our sort of specialist one-stop shop way to somewhere near where the most vulnerable women are in London. So yeah, a short answer to a really meaningful bit of work that we did, which means that the hopscotch of today is very different to the pre-lockdown hopscotch, where you know you literally had somebody doing employment there and somebody doing welfare advice here. Now we're working together, and that means we're able to work in a far more trauma-informed and person-centered way, which is, you know, part of our mission.
Thank you. Perhaps go to Jeanette to hear a little bit about in the local area what that mapping meant to you, what you found, and perhaps how that something with you in the club.
Yeah, by all means. We first of all, we really struggled to start off with the mapping, because through the mapping we identified that lots of other people were mapping at the same time. You know, there were bits going on all over the city where there was pieces of work on little areas and mapping that out. So we were able to harness that with our navigator to actually pull that together. So instead of it being all over, we actually got that bigger picture of what was going on in Leeds. And I suppose one of the things we also identified, and this is going on to one of our successes of the project as well, was that we identified there were gaps in services for women who were, you know, needed the support, especially around, you mentioned it earlier on, around having their children in care. And that was one of the big things across Leeds, that we found that there was a group, it needed more funding, you know, so that became one of our successes, and we identified that through the mapping, you know, across the city, that wasn't happening. So that was a real success. And I will talk about that a little bit later on if you give me the opportunity to do that. Yeah, but also what we identified was that we were able to pinpoint good practice and areas of practice, and again we utilised those, and again it was the navigator's experience that actually brought that to the forefront, and she works really hard supporting other groups and organisations, and in particular around the housing sector. And we know the housing wasn't an actual outcome from this project, but actually we got lots of outcomes by engaging the housing sector, you know, through that mapping, you know, to actually work with them to develop better outcomes for the women through that housing sector and that housing network. So it was sort of like a roundabout sort of way through the mapping that we identified all these other things that the project benefited from. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's that ability to say actually housing is part of the solution. Even if it wasn't the need we thought we were going to address, but it had to be part of the solution.
We were saying that, yeah.
Brilliant. Leonie, over to you perhaps to tell us a little bit about the kind of national role that you guys played and the success you saw from that surviving youth.
Yeah, so as a training partner, we were delivering workshops for professionals as well as for women. And it was one of our successes that we see is that it was the first time we were delivering service users to women. And even though some of the challenges that Sarah talked about, that we might have had a low uptake or cancellations on the day, we were still able to kind of deliver workshops around economic abuse, money, debt, financial capability, and also how banks might be able to help a victim survivor to about 78 women across. So that was a big success. It was something that C, as a somewhat new organisation, new charity, only 5 years old, hasn't done before. So that was seen as a big success. But also the connection of being able to meet. I know we've got Selma from SheWise in the room, being able to make connections with smaller organisations, sisters who are doing amazing things, just being able to have that connection through the navigators, the mapping of local need, and that connecting it to a national training partner was just invaluable to have that additional reach that we might not get in our own doings that we do as a research and organisational. Yeah, so they're definitely some of the successes.
Amazing, thank you. So I'm gonna go to Jeanette so I don't start the same order every time. And then you have a chance to go first this time. Could you tell us a bit about what you valued about the approach that was taken and how it's been a bit different to other things you've done?
But I think the overall thing that we absolutely found fantastic was the flexible open door approach that allowed us to test and do things differently, but still within the remit of the project. You gave us that freedom, I mean, to do things in a way that we felt best. I mean, we actually didn't employ a full-time navigator. We dropped that down to part-time navigator who was very experienced in what she was doing, had those links already. So that then, again, going back to that flexible approach, allowed us the flexibility to test and pilot and do different things, and to support certainly the Rosebuds group that I've just talked about, you know, to continue, because that was such a needed thing in the city that we felt we had to invest in that for the benefit of the women who attended it. So I really, really value that flexible approach, and that's the one thing I think we would take away. And we just wish that every funder would offer that, you know, instead of being really prescriptive and saying this is what you want. And of course the open door conversations with Alia when we were struggling with some things, you know, we had a huge concern around trying to link in with older women. You know, we couldn't do that. We no matter how we tried, we found it really difficult. So it was having that open door to say, we're struggling with this, you know, can we try this and can we try that, or come and as a project as a whole, you know, well actually there are others that are achieving in that area, so you do what you want to do best, which was like, oh, fantastic. And that's what we really valued about the approach from Solace and Alia and the team.
Thank you. And Vanessa, perhaps a little bit on the different approach and how it's benefited your organisation.
Yeah, so through speaking to professionals, we realised that what we thought was true, which was there's a distinct lack of understanding of cultural sensitivities and issues for Black and minoritized women who are under stress. There's a distinct lack of understanding of trauma-informed practice. And that led us to deepen our own thinking, and it brought us to this point of understanding this is actually a human rights issue. And
You came to that conclusion.
yeah, exactly. And so Fairuz and the team drove that forward, and we've ended up partnering with the British Institute of Human Rights. And really that was a conversation we just had over lunch, was what do we do next? We need a human rights department, you know, and like what does that look like? Who would fund that? But you know, before this project we probably wouldn't have got to this place. It was just being faced with the stats, you know, when housing department is saying, but this woman keeps calling me every 20 minutes. I can't really understand what she's saying. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that statement. You know, she's saying that because her English isn't her first language, and she's calling you every 20 minutes because she's in trauma. That's the only control she has. Now, if you as a housing officer don't understand that, we've got a fundamental human rights problem. So that this is just one example of, where this project has brought us through that agility with the funding, and we've been able to work so flexibly to get to this point because of the way Solace really championed all of our organisations to be able to work like that.
Amazing, yeah, I think to see that where that could go in the future as well will be amazing to see. I think as legacy for the project as well, so that sounds incredible. Can I go over to you, Eleni, to finish off on the approach? I think it's slightly different for training partners, but there was some other challenges about the reality of doing this in COVID.
Yes.
Your organisation as well.
Yes, definitely. I think some of the value of the approach. I know we've talked about agility and flexibility and the funding from a training point of view. That from the mapping, connecting with navigators and seeing the mapping and the need around Black and minoritized communities. So he was able to reflect on the gaps in what we have, and was able to use the flexible funding through the projects to look at where we could build kind of capacity, and we were able to take some of our training resources and our media resources, subtitle them and translate them to different languages to build that accessibility. So definitely something we valued was that kind of flexibility and funding to look at what the navigators were telling us, look at what we're offering, and then seeing where we can bridge gaps and move closer to it.
Yeah, I think that came out for one of our other national training partners, Rights of Women, where some of the guides and the resources that they created during the project actually were guided by the mapping, which I think was a really great way to be able to do it, is take that intelligence in local areas and see what women's rights issues were, and then provide that practical guidance and support for the sector. Next question. Come to you again.
Okay.
To keep on my pattern of changing things. Now you've been through the project, we've had 18 months delivering, we're coming towards the end. What do you think are the most pressing needs for the women's sector in your area?
I think nationally, as like a research and education organisation, I think one of the biggest kind of issues or pressing issues is creating that space for buy-in for and smaller organisations not to be pushed out or squeezed out in funding, and as national organisations to advocate and create that space for smaller organisations, so that buy-in for women, organisations for women are not kind of squeezed out of commissioning. So I think that's probably the first thing that kind of comes to my mind is pressing issues, but also just funding in general to keep this collaborative work, this co-producing together. The Labyrinth is such a great legacy from what we're doing with the Centre of Excellence and all the network we've done and coming together. It would be a shame to lose that. So I guess that's also a pressing issue, to keep the momentum going of that collaborative and kind of national working together.
And keeping those relationships going, I think, and a network of women's organisations can test ideas or learn from each other. What we saw a lot in Labyrinth is an incredible amount of ideas out there. Actually, just another organisation who might have done something similar to go to and just get a bit of advice is really valuable. And day to day, that's hard to find when you're still trying to keep the organisation afloat or support the women. So I think that ability to make those connections.
And we've already seen it in the room today.
Yes, exactly. That was a great example.
I think it's so important that there is these opportunities to nurture relationships, support each other in the business sector.
Can I ask you that one a bit more on what you think's next, or what are the pressing issues for your area and support?
Well, I think after you've done mapping, you're going to try and fill those gaps. And from my perspective, alongside planning your delivery comes something a bit more systemic, and you have to be looking at strategy and governance. And so I would love to see the Centre of Excellence bit of work of this project really fly now and deepen, so that everybody knows exactly where they're going to for that, more systemic support. Because without robust governance, you're going to be at the mercy of whatever the environmental situation is going to be. Another lockdown could floor you. So that's what I would like to see happen next, alongside from a delivery perspective of this understanding of where human rights sits when it comes to violence against women and girls.
So, thank you. Jeanette,
I
over
was
to
gonna
you.
say, I totally agree with your bit about the Centre of Excellence, because we've had women who've accessed that and really value that, you know, so it's such a shame for it to not continue in that sense. But if you'd have asked me that, if you're asking me this question, and I'm like, I'm gonna base some of my answers on today, now, the here and now, because at the moment we're grappling with the cost of living, we're grappling with women not being able to afford to live, the heating crisis, and then we've got Christmas coming around the corner. So there is a lot of conversation and discussion at the moment where we are around that, you know, so I can't not mention that now, because we are very reactive and we're looking at what are we going to do then. So we're working together with our partners to try and address some of those things in Leeds. But going back to my comment earlier on, and you mentioned it, it was around housing. And if you can't get that fundamental grounding of somebody having somewhere safe to live and secure to live, you know, a lot of things will just increase and develop and become more of a crisis level, you know, mental health will rise, you know, all sorts of stuff. So that is still a pressing need in Leeds, and I'm guessing it's a pressing need across the country, getting that really good, affordable, safe and not damp housing, because there's huge issues around the private sector now and tenancies and things like that. I think that those are those. Again, health and well-being still remains top of the list, you know, and mental health is growing, you know, so we're still got to be mindful of that. And this is all, you know, as we're rolling out of the pandemic, feels like a different sort of pandemic with the cost of living and the heating stuff going on, and we're all going to be having to address that as well. So I suppose that's a long way around answering, but you know, housing is what we would still identify as our number one priority to get right.
Yeah, I think the sector this project was in response to the COVID-19 crisis, and we're not even really out of that or been able to deal with the impact of that, and yet we're straight back into a crisis that we know disproportionately impacts women. And so I think, it can't not be part of the conversation, absolutely. And I think, speaking from Solace a little bit, housing's our kind of number one issue in terms of the systemic thing to see. If women can't get access to safe housing, how can they possibly, you know, look to improve their well-being, you know, get the support around mental health? And I think, you know, the point you made around that, it actually the local authority or that response is different for Black and minoritized women, and we need to recognise that actually that then means those other impacts are going to be felt more, are going to be more exacerbated for that group as well. So yeah, housing is a key issue for Solace, but clearly something that across the Labyrinth project is being identified and looking at it from a human rights lens is really important. So we talked about a lot of the positives, and I think we'll just do one more question, then a final reflection from the panel, if that's all right. It's been really positive, which is amazing, but I think let's talk about a couple of the challenges. I'm sure that there always is something, an 18-month project that's looking to deliver the amount we did is going to see some challenges. So Vanessa, can I go first to you on some of the challenges you found in the project?
I think that it was shocking how poor the understanding of the multiple needs and the barriers of Black and minoritized women are amongst professionals. I think that really shocked us, didn't it, Various, and made us, we had to stop and rethink everything that we're doing in light of that. And so, yeah, I suppose it's a positive in that the project brought it up, but it's a real negative that we're still there. Sometimes it feels like it's changing.
I'm actually thinking that's the scale of the problem
It's
you're trying
huge.
to address. It's huge, and no one project can do that. That's so much bigger than that. We can go to you on this one.
Yeah, challenges are thinking about, I guess it was working with devolved nations and looking at having a training offer that spoke to Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England. That was a challenge of ours to make sure that we had enough kind of buy-in, but was also relevant enough so our partners in Scotland, Northern Ireland would consider the training would be for their women service users and for professionals themselves. So that was one of our challenges, to make ourselves relevant in those areas. And then also another kind of challenge was to consider, I know I've spoken about the funding and what we did regarding languages and trying to increase our resource accessibility. The challenge is trying to think about what we can do with our budget to do that. I know from Navigator there was questions around could we be doing training in other languages and looking at the budget of that and the costings of that and what we could and couldn't achieve in the scope of the project. So making those kind of difficult decisions of which avenues to explore, which have the most reach and meaningful reach, but knowing that I always do more to make regards with a training partner for resources.
I'm surprised actually no one's mentioned it, because the biggest challenge we had was having to deliver it all under lockdown restrictions. You know, and it was both a challenge, but we actually benefited because, as Sarah said earlier on, we took on board that online learning and absolutely just turned the whole of the delivery world upside down by going online. And we ended up engaging equally as many people, I imagine. But if we weren't under lockdown restrictions, but the whole business of working from your home and developing a partnership, like I say, we've all met for the first time today here face to face, and we were involved in an 18-month project, yet it was very successful. You know, that was a huge challenge. And then locally, that had a bearing on how people were taking on board what we wanted to do, because lockdown, you know, had an effect on everybody else. So again, there was very much of this conflicting priorities. We were having to deliver a project, but there was much more important, bigger fish to fry, you know, in other people's organisations. So it was again linking in with those partners and really supporting each other through that sort of thread of lockdown, you know, so that we could all help and deliver. And I could not really talk about that as being the biggest challenge, because it was.
And I think, you know, we hope Labyrinth will bring, you know, strength to the sector and resource and capacity for the sector. But we were coming to the sector with this project at one of the most stretched and stressful times it's ever been through, and an organisation having to rethink how and what they do. And so, of course, that is going to impact the way in which some organisations were able to engage. So, yeah.
There is, if I could just add, you know, there was a moment of learning for us, a humbling moment where Isabel Terrace and our head of programs and we had a really long meeting at the beginning of lockdowns. What was this going to mean to our service users? And in reality, women are resilient, you know, and I don't know how they found their strength to go online. They found their strength to figure out technology and to realize that actually a lot of our workshops, it was better for them to be online because their children could just be there and be happy in the home environment rather than in a creche or whatever else we could set up. And our numbers didn't drop, you know, but it was a real wow moment for us, whereas we thought this was just going to be disastrous, as you
It's
said.
a big learning point, massive learning point about how to be very creative in your delivery. Yeah, online, you know, more we're engaging with, just like you say, because they're at home in that environment, the children are there.
I think that comes to the resilience of the women's sector and women's organisations that we take and we see it in women, and therefore it's kind of inspiring to do the same for our organisations. I think that's a nice place to stop, perhaps. I was going to ask kind of one more reflection, but I think that's a pretty great one to finish on. I suppose, do we have time to do a quick question or two?
Anyone? Yeah, one or two, maybe.
Anyone has any questions for our panel today, or anything about about what we've heard from them? We're very close to time, so if not, I can just do closing remarks. That's not a problem. Brilliant. Okay. Well, a huge thank you to our speakers and our partners today for talking about the project. I think one of the things that came up today actually was a couple of people talking about the Centre for Excellence, so it's a good time for me to talk about that. I think that's one.
I did have one question. Sorry,
Oh,
this comes through.
yeah, no, that's great.
So it's got, how are you working with second tier organisations? We already have second tier organisations such as Women's Resource Centre, RCEW, I should know who that is, Women's Aid and IMCAN, who have and are doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we wanted to do with this project, that's why the Navigator function was so important to go locally, was actually because it's about bringing local communities together. We know that there's that national work that supports organisations and helps build capacity. What we wanted Labyrinth to do was to go into Hampshire or Leeds or London for Solace and Hopscotch, and actually be able to map on a smaller level to see what's happening in the sector. So that's how we felt there was a point of difference to doing that work of those second tier organisations, which hugely support organisations across England and Wales, the ones we were talking about there, but across the UK. That's what we saw with the point of difference. Panelists, that's given my first response, but anything else? You the ones doing the local delivery.
Yeah, I mean, we find ourselves doing a lot of infrastructure work with grassroots organisations, and I'm hoping that that's what this project has given, a little bit of strength to organisations to know that they can do that too, because sharing is caring.
Women helping women, yeah, absolutely. And there's smaller connections as well. So yeah, to the Centre for Excellence. So yeah, I think the part of the Labyrinth project was to set up, I suppose, a repository and a legacy for the project. So a lot of the learnings and things we're talking about today, whether that's resources on legal issues or economic issues, or just how we've done some of the work we've done in the Labyrinth, there is a central repository for that. So the Centre for Excellence is out there, and we'll send around a link as follow-up from the event, so people can see some of the resources that were out there. But we're looking for the best practice, the models, the ways of working that we've seen across England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland in this project. So we're hoping to have a central place that women's organisations and women themselves can come and find those resources. We know they're out there. We know there's amazing things happening. It's about sharing that and allowing an easy access to that information. And I think, as Sarah really well plugged, we've got our evaluation report of the project. We will be sharing the executive summary of that round with you after the event today, and we'll look out for the sort of full report in January, which will go into the detail of the how and what we did in Labyrinth. But those kind of 5 key pillars that we talked about earlier are covered in that exec summary. So that leaves me just to say thank you very much for those joining us in the room and those joining us online. And yeah, thanks very much for hearing more about the Labyrinth project. And we look forward to hearing more from you from Centre for Excellence and you about the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you.